Hey there, this is Alexis Knight. Welcome to True Crime, the Court of Public Opinion. I'm your host, guiding you through cases that have moved through the courts and reached a conclusion but left the public divided. These aren't your typical cut and dried cases. These are the ones where the facts might seem clear, but the truth? Well, that's another story. Now, imagine you're at work, you're doing whatever you're doing on any given day, and your phone buzzes with news of a shocking crime. Laci Peterson, a beautiful and pregnant woman, has gone missing in Modesto, California. The search for Laci ignites a media frenzy, and the entire country watches as her husband, Scott Peterson, becomes the prime suspect. In December of 2002, Laci was reported missing on Christmas Eve, just days before she was due to give birth to their son, Connor. The investigation quickly unraveled a tragic narrative filled with conflicting evidence. Scott's behavior, including his secret affair with Amber Frey, it all raised suspicions. But did that alone justify a murder conviction? On April 18th in 2003, the bodies of Laci and Connor were discovered in San Francisco Bay, and Scott was arrested shortly after. Prosecution painted a picture of a calculating man who wanted to escape the burdens of fatherhood, while the defense argued that the evidence was circumstantial at best. Ultimately, Scott was convicted of 2 counts of murder in November of 2004. After receiving a death sentence that stirred heated debates and questions about the integrity of the trial process. Many believe he was wrongfully convicted, claiming there was insufficient evidence to support the prosecution's narrative. As we explore this case, we'll uncover the controversies, the questions surrounding the evidence, and the profound impact this trial has had on public perception of justice. All right, let's get to the core of the matter here. The Scott Peterson case is not just about a tragic crime. It's a complex web of narratives that raises questions, pressing questions, about guilt, innocence, and the influence of public perception. The central question we grapple with today is, was Scott Peterson guilty of murder based solely on the evidence presented? Or was he the victim of a flawed legal process that prioritized narrative over facts? At the heart of this case lies the tragic story of Laci Peterson, a pregnant woman who disappeared in December of 2002, just weeks before she was due to give birth. When her body and that of their unborn son Connor were discovered in San Francisco Bay months later, the public's attention quickly turned to her husband, Scott Peterson. And what followed was a media storm that scrutinized every single aspect of Scott's life, from his marriage to Laci to his behavior during the investigation. Scott's demeanor during interviews was under the microscope. Many found his calmness unsettling, particularly during televised pleas for help in finding his wife. Critics pointed to his seemingly composed nature as evidence of guilt, interpreting it as a sign of someone who knew more than he was letting on. Yet it's important to remember that grief can manifest in many ways. Some individuals react with intense emotion, while others may appear calm or even detached. This raises the question, can we truly judge a person's guilt based on their emotional response to a traumatic event? Prosecution built its case on a series of circumstantial pieces of evidence that painted Scott as a calculating individual who wanted to escape the responsibilities of being a father. Their narrative suggested that Scott had a motive to kill Laci due to his affair with Amber Frey, which he had started around the time of Laci's disappearance. They posited that Scott was living a double life, one as a devoted husband and soon-to-be father, and another as a man seeking freedom from the confines of marriage. However, this narrative overlooks the possibility that relationships can be complicated, and infidelity, while morally troubling, does not inherently lead to murder. Moreover, the prosecution pointed to Scott's actions following Laci's disappearance as suspicious. He took a fishing trip to the San Francisco Bay Area just days after reporting her missing, and this became a focal point of the prosecution's argument, suggesting that he was either disposing of evidence or preparing for life without Laci. Yet critics of this narrative highlight that many individuals respond to crisis situations in unexpected ways, and a fishing trip could easily be interpreted as an attempt to escape the emotional turmoil, rather than an act of guilt. With all eyes on him, maybe some quiet time in his boat was what he needed. Throughout the trial, the prosecution presented a theory that Scott had murdered Laci and dumped her body in the bay. Yet the evidence supporting this claim was circumstantial at best. For instance, the infamous blood-stained carpet found in the Peterson home raised eyebrows, but forensic experts could not definitively link it to Laci. If you did not know that, there were no fingerprints or DNA evidence tying Scott to a crime scene. There just weren't, and there was a distinct lack of witnesses who could corroborate the prosecution's timeline of events. And that seems like a lot of holes. The lack of direct evidence is a critical element that many believe should have weighed heavily in Scott's favor. In a case where the stakes are as high as life and death, the absence of concrete proof is alarming. It poses a crucial question. How can someone be convicted of such a serious crime when the evidence presented does not unequivocally point to guilt? In our legal system, the principle of innocent until proven guilty is foundational. Yet in the court of public opinion, Scott's presumed guilt seemed to overshadow any lack of solid evidence. I really didn't hear a lot of people talking about that. Did you? Moreover, as the investigation unfolded, several potential alternative suspects were overlooked. Some have pointed out that the investigation seemed fixated on Scott from the beginning, leading to a lack of thorough inquiries into other possibilities. And this has led to theories that other individuals may have been involved, including claims of a local cult that was responsible at the time for the disappearances of pregnant women. The notion that a broader investigation could have revealed additional suspects adds layers to this case and raises more questions about whether justice was truly served here. In addition, the role of the media in shaping public perception cannot be understated. The trial was not merely a legal proceeding. It became a media spectacle that captivated everyone across the nation. News outlets covered the trial extensively, often focusing on sensational aspects rather than the details of the legal arguments. And this relentless coverage turned Scott into a public figure, often vilified in the court of public opinion long before the jury ever reached its verdict. The portrayal of Scott Peterson in the media, filled with speculation and opinion, undoubtedly influenced how the public viewed the evidence and him. What if it were you? Would that sit okay with you? As the trial progressed, Scott's image as a grieving husband began to crumble under the weight of public scrutiny. Media narratives often painted him as a villain, suggesting that he was cold and calculating and lacking in remorse. And the public perception becomes, during all of this, a significant force inside the courtroom. Many jurors, potentially influenced by the overwhelming media coverage and societal pressure to render that verdict of guilty. The phenomenon, because it is a phenomenon, it raises critical questions about how media portrayal can distort the quest for justice and whether it can lead to miscarriages of justice. Throughout the trial, the defense team attempted to counter the prosecution's narrative, emphasizing the circumstantial nature of the evidence and the lack of a motive strong enough to justify murder. They argued that Scott was not a monster. He was a man caught in an unimaginable situation. And they painted a portrait of a couple deeply in love, struggling with the challenges of impending parenthood, and suggested that Scott's affair did not equate to a desire to harm Laci. Yet despite their efforts, the narrative had already taken root in the minds of the public and the jury. The prosecution's portrayal of Scott as a man who had everything to gain from Laci's death, it resonated powerfully, while the defense's arguments about the lack of concrete evidence struggled to break through the noise of public sentiment. As we get deeper into this case here, consider your own beliefs. Can a conviction be justified when the evidence is primarily circumstantial? Does the public's perception, influenced by sensationalism and the media portrayal, distort the quest for true justice? Where do you draw the line between survival and criminality, especially in a case where the nuances of human emotion and the complexities of familial relationships come into play? This case challenges us to think critically about the justice system and the potential for a miscarriage of justice in the face of overwhelming public opinion. It invites us to reflect on the nature of truth and how it can be obscured by the loud clamor of societal judgments and media narratives. The Scott Peterson case is not just about a tragic murder. This is a cautionary tale about the dangers of rushing to judgment and the vital importance of evidence in the pursuit of justice. The Scott Peterson case is steeped in controversy, not just for the crime and its aftermath, but for the broader implications it has on the justice system as well as public perception. This case remains unresolved in the minds of so many, with ongoing debates about whether the legal verdict reflects true justice or is shaped by societal biases and media influence. At the heart of this controversy lies the nature of evidence against Scott Peterson. Now, while the prosecution argued that Scott had a clear motive to kill Laci due to his extramarital affair, the actual evidence presented was largely circumstantial. And affairs don't equal murder, and we've seen this in many cases since Scott Peterson. The absence of definitive proof linking Scott directly to the crime has led many to question the integrity of the investigation and the fairness of the trial. Scott's behavior following Laci's disappearance raised suspicions, with many interpreting his calm demeanor and actions, like taking that fishing trip shortly after reporting Laci missing. Some saw this as indicative of guilt. However, there were some experts that suggested that people respond to trauma in various ways, and his behavior may not have been as suspicious as it seemed. Critics of the prosecution pointed out the circumstantial nature of evidence, or tried to. Although a blood-stained carpet was found in the Peterson home, forensic experts could not definitively link it to Laci at all. The absence of eyewitnesses who could confirm Scott's involvement in disposing of a body raises further questions. No one saw him get the body into his boat, his truck, a pregnant woman. It's very hard to move a dead body. And how can someone be convicted of such a serious crime when the evidence presented does not unequivocally point to guilt? Moreover, the investigation appeared to overlook other potential suspects, like I said. There were reports of this local cult that were involved in the disappearances of pregnant women around this time of Laci's disappearance, and they were not thoroughly investigated, which should have been maybe the number one thing. This failure to explore the alternative suspects raises concerns about whether law enforcement was too focused on Scott as the prime suspect. The media's role in shaping public perception, again, we cannot overstate this. This case was wild with it. From the outset, the trial attracted national attention, A lot of cases do. News outlets were providing extensive coverage that often sensationalized the details. So while the news is sensationalizing everything so it looks great for you to watch, you're not actually getting any news. Scott was portrayed not as a grieving husband, but as a cold-blooded killer, which contributed, for sure, to a biased public opinion that may have even influenced the jury. What if that jury was coming to judge you, and the media was portraying you not as you were, if that's what happened here? How would you feel? The emotional appeals made by the prosecution during this trial were also significant. They emphasized the very tragic nature of Laci's murder, which it was. They focused on the loss of life and the impact on the entire Peterson family. While emotional narratives can be compelling, they can also cloud jurors' judgment, leading to decisions based on feelings, not facts. Now, after the verdict, public opinion remained sharply divided. Some believed Scott was guilty based on the evidence presented, while others argued that the prosecution's case was insufficient. This division highlights a larger issue within the justice system: the disparity between legal outcomes and public sentiment. The Scott Peterson case has become a cautionary tale about how media narratives and public opinion can distort the quest for true justice. And whether or not that's what happened here, it is happening, and it is a cautionary tale. Now, following this trial, this case continued to draw attention. It kept going. It prompted new documentaries and discussions around the integrity of the legal process. Advocates for Scott's innocence have called for a re-examination of the evidence, arguing that the original proceedings were flawed. They assert that the reliance on circumstantial evidence and the influence of public sentiment ultimately led to a miscarriage of justice here. Additionally, the case has highlighted the importance of mental health considerations in evaluating the actions of individuals involved in violent crimes. Understanding how trauma impacts behavior can provide crucial context, yet it remains an often overlooked aspect of the legal process. We are all using our brains for anything that we do. It would be helpful to understand how it works. This case raises significant questions about the nature of evidence, the influence of media narratives, and the ethics of prosecutorial strategies in high-stakes trials. The lingering questions about Scott's guilt or innocence point to a broader societal challenge. How can we ensure that justice is served fairly and equitably? The Scott Peterson case continues, still to this day, to evoke strong emotions and provoke discussions about the fundamental principles of justice, the role of public opinion, and the potential for reform within the legal system. All right, well, let's get into the facts. What did they do with what they had in this trial? The story of Scott Peterson and the tragic disappearance of Laci Peterson. It all begins on December 24th in 2002, when Laci, who was 8 months pregnant, was reported missing from their home in Modesto, California. The couple had been married since 1997 and were eagerly anticipating the arrival of their first child. However, that Christmas Eve, the joyous occasion turned into a nightmare as Laci's family grew increasingly concerned for her safety. Scott Peterson, a successful fertilizer salesman, was initially cooperative with law enforcement during the search for his wife. He appeared on television, pleading for Laci's safe return and expressing his deep love for her. However, as the days turned into weeks without any sign of Laci, suspicion began to swirl around Scott. His demeanor during interviews was scrutinized, and the media started to portray him as a possible suspect in her disappearance. The search for Laci intensified as authorities launched a comprehensive investigation. Volunteers, search teams, and law enforcement officers scoured the surrounding areas, including the nearby parks and the river. Scott initially participated in these search efforts, but his involvement quickly shifted to a more suspicious light as the investigation progressed. The public's perception of Scott began to change as well as details of his personal life surfaced. In the weeks following Laci's disappearance, Scott's actions raised eyebrows. He was reported to have had an extramarital affair with Amber Fry, a woman he'd been dating for several months, while still married to Laci while she's pregnant. Scott had initially lied to Amber about Laci's whereabouts. He told her he was a widower, and this revelation did add a layer of complexity to the case, as many began to speculate that Scott's infidelity could have been a motive for murder. On April 18, 2003, a significant break in the case occurred when the bodies of Laci and her unborn son were discovered in San Francisco Bay. Laci's body was found washed ashore, and an autopsy revealed she had been deceased for several weeks. This discovery sent shockwaves through the community and fueled the fire of speculation regarding Scott's involvement in her death. The investigation continued to gather evidence against Scott. Authorities discovered that he had purchased a boat shortly before Laci's disappearance, and this became a focal point of the prosecution's narrative. The prosecution argued that Scott used the boat to dispose of Laci's body in the bay. But this claim raised questions about the lack of direct evidence tying him to the crime. As the trial approached, the prosecution presented its case, which hinged largely on circumstantial evidence. They argued that Scott had a motive to kill Laci due to the affair and the impending responsibilities of fatherhood. Their case relied heavily on Scott's behavior after Laci's disappearance, highlighting his lack of emotion during interviews and his actions during the search. In July of 2004, the trial commenced, drawing national attention and media coverage. The prosecution presented its case first, introducing evidence that they claimed connected Scott to Laci's murder. They focused on his behavior, suggesting that his calm demeanor and efforts to maintain a normal life were all indicative of guilt. Key pieces of evidence presented included Scott's statements to law enforcement, his extramarital affair, and the timeline of his actions during the days surrounding Laci's disappearance. The prosecution also discussed the discovery of Laci's body in the bay, emphasizing the idea that Scott had used the boat to transport her remains. The defense argued the prosecution's narrative by arguing that the evidence was circumstantial. There was no direct proof linking Scott to this crime. They emphasized the absence of any witnesses who could confirm Scott's involvement and the lack of physical evidence. No fingerprints, no DNA that tied him to Laci's murder. During the trial, the defense also brought forward witnesses who testified to Scott's character and his relationship with Laci. They painted a picture of a loving husband who was deeply invested in his family and eager to become a father. The defense sought to challenge the prosecution's claims by highlighting the complexities of their marriage and the challenges that they were facing as a couple. As the trial progressed, various experts were called to testify, including forensic specialists and psychologists. The defense attempted to introduce the idea of alternative suspects, suggesting that law enforcement had not thoroughly investigated other leads. However, the prosecution maintained a focused narrative that pointed the finger squarely at Scott, painting him as the sole perpetrator of the crime. In November 2004, after weeks of deliberation, the jury reached their verdict. Scott Peterson was found guilty of 2 counts of murder: first-degree murder for the death of Laci and second-degree murder for the death of their unborn son, Connor. The conviction shocked many, as the evidence against him was primarily circumstantial. The case against Scott Peterson was deeply polarizing, and public opinion was sharply divided. Many believed that the conviction was justified, while others argued that the lack of direct evidence should have warranted an acquittal. Following the verdict, Scott was sentenced to death. And the case continued to draw attention and controversy, with debates surrounding the trial's integrity and the evidence presented. In the years that followed, Scott Peterson's case underwent various appeals, with his defense team arguing the trial had been marred by numerous legal errors. And these appeals sought to challenge the validity of that evidence, and the fairness of the trial, and the influence of the media on the proceedings. The ongoing discussions around the case once again highlight the difficulties of the legal system, the challenges, and the potential for miscarriages of justice in these kinds of high-profile trials. As public interest in the case persisted, and still does, new documentaries, books, podcasts all came out, re-examining the evidence in the trial's proceedings. Advocates for Scott's innocence argue that the legal system failed him, plain and simple, calling attention to the shortcomings of the prosecution's case and the reliance on that circumstantial evidence. In 2020, not that long ago, the California Supreme Court upheld Scott Peterson's conviction, but they did order a new sentencing hearing, citing issues with the original jury selection process. And this development reignited debates about the case, as supporters of Scott continued to advocate for his innocence and the need for a fair trial. This case is an obvious example of how public opinion can maybe shape outcomes. It raises very important questions about the nature of evidence, the influence of media, the ethics of strategies. If you look at the arguments on both sides and look at this case, what if it was your case? This man had an affair. He was about to have a baby. Some say he loved his wife. Some say he was terrified of fatherhood. Maybe that's what the affair was about, but we don't know. Evidence? There is no blood linking him to the scene. There is no DNA. Nobody saw him ever move, transport, try to pack up his pregnant woman's body. He was in the San Francisco Bay. No one saw him with a pregnant body in the boat. Have you seen the boat? It's not that big. How can this happen? And you would think that maybe you'd be safe if there was nothing linking you to a crime. But in this case, guilty, sentenced to death. And his defense team, they gave a good argument. Normally, if you don't have evidence, you're not guilty. They also had to navigate the challenges posed by a media narrative that often painted Scott in a negative light. They worked to counteract the perceptions of guilt that had already been placed out there and planted before the trial even began. This case highlights the dangers of this, allowing public opinion and media portrayals to interfere with the judicial process. Whether one believes Scott Peterson is guilty or innocent, was this process okay? Was there enough to convict him, sentence him to death? Or was there just nobody else? As we reach the conclusion of this examination of the Scott Peterson case, it's essential to reflect on what we've learned and talked about here and consider the broader implications of this tragic story. Throughout this episode, we went into the details, we explored the conflicting narratives, talked about the media, public perception. And now it's time for me to invite you to weigh the evidence and try to form your own opinion. Can you commit to guilty or innocent? At the heart of this case lies the question of justice. Was Scott Peterson guilty of murdering his wife Laci and their unborn son Connor? The conviction he received was largely based on circumstantial evidence, a factor that many argue should weigh heavily in our understanding of guilt. The principle of innocent until proven guilty is foundational to our legal system, yet in high-profile cases like this, where the public is involved, the rush to judgment can lead to profound injustices. The prosecution's case relied on a narrative that painted Scott as a man with a motive. with opportunity and intent. They emphasized his extramarital affair and his behavior during the search for Laci as key indicators of guilt. However, the defense's argument challenged these points. Was he just a to-be father that was scared? They highlighted the circumstantial nature of the evidence as well, the absence of any direct proof linking Scott to this crime. It's crucial to ask ourselves, can a conviction truly stand when the evidence presented is not definitive? Moreover, the investigation into Laci's disappearance raises significant questions. Critics have pointed to the failure of law enforcement to thoroughly explore other potential suspects, including that alleged cult linked already to the disappearances of pregnant women in that area. The media's portrayal of Scott also plays a critical role in shaping our perceptions of guilt. Their coverage was intense, often sensationalized. Is that fair to us in the public? Should we be angry that the news didn't really give us the news? And if a case like this, where public perception can influence guilt or innocence, if the public decides that there was a wrong in a case like this or any case, can their influence the justice system to reduce an unfair sentencing and judgment? How often do we see that happen? And should it? Shouldn't it? Was justice truly served in this case? Does the ongoing debate signal a need for further examination of the evidence and the legal process? As you reflect on this tragic story, remember that the pursuit of truth is an ongoing journey, one that requires vigilance, compassion, and a commitment to understanding human behavior and societal dynamics. A lot to consider in this case and all cases. Thank you for joining me in this exploration of the Scott Peterson case in True Crime, the Court of Public Opinion. Stay safe out there, guys. Stay curious. Keep asking the questions. And until next time, this is Alexis Knight.